In 1914, the British Empire went to war. The contribution of the West Indies has remained a forgotten history for 100 years.
With regards to the English-speaking Caribbean, not only was it a question of having centuries of relationships with Britain through commerce, education and administration, but I think that centrally religion and the social structure was very much a British imprint, and therefore they felt an affiliation by virtue of that. And so the Caribbean, despite its own problems with natural disasters, managed to submit over £2 million in cash and over £54 million worth of goods and assets in aid, including cutting-edge technology such as 9 aeroplanes.
As soon as war was declared, Caribbean men were eager to serve in the British Army, yet their offers fell on deaf ears. Eventually, the need for men on the Western Front became so urgent that King George issued a personal appeal for Caribbean men to enlist, and in October 1915, the British West Indies Regiment was formed. The volunteers received a warm welcome when they arrived in England, and unlike many Englishmen who were rejected for service on the grounds of poor health, the West Indians were praised as huge and mighty men of valour.
In 1916, a contingent of West Indians participated by invitation in the Lord Mayor's show. When I think about the service of the British West Indies Regiment, I always think of that recruitment poster that announces men from every class, colour and creed come and support your king and country. And I think that today we have managed to define the Caribbean society in such a simplistic form that we have forgotten who we truly are. We are people of every class, colour and creed from the 4 corners of the world. A wonderful example of how diverse Caribbean society is the case of Frank Alexander Dupas, who was the first Jewish recipient of a Victoria Cross. His family was not only closely related in terms of integrated into Caribbean society, but they were also members of the West India Committee.
The story of these Caribbean volunteers became tragic early on. The Vidala was a troop ship whose passage to England was diverted via Halifax, Nova Scotia, because of the threat posed by German U-boats. The Jamaican passengers were disastrously under-equipped to withstand such cold conditions. 120 men had their frostbitten limbs and digits amputated. These were the first casualties to return home, while their comrades continued on to serve in the Labour Corps on the Western Front.
Britain has a very small army when the war breaks out. And much of that army is distributed across the empire. Indeed, the British Expeditionary Force that goes to France in 1914 at the beginning of the war is only about 100,000 men, tiny in relation to armies of millions raised by European powers. Those armies need not just men to fight, but men to build trenches, men to maintain roads, men to mend railway lines. There is an enormous logistical effort required to sustain a mass army in the field. And that's the function of Labour Corps.
Not all of the British West Indies Regiment served exclusively in the Labour Corps. The 1st and 2nd Battalions fought in combat roles in the North African and Middle Eastern campaigns. Each battalion had a machine gun section. In these fast-paced and harsh theatres of war, the men performed with distinction.
The defeat of the Ottoman Empire becomes crucially important. And Palestine is the way into the Ottoman Empire from the southern end. I mean, that is the wider strategic significance. It becomes important more immediately when, in 1917, Lloyd George, as the Prime Minister, is not very happy with waging costly offensives in France and would rather push for a campaign in Palestine, as he put it, to give Jerusalem to the British people as a Christmas present.
The significance of liberating Jerusalem was not lost on these soldiers. They were present in the Holy Land and surrounded by scenes of Armageddon. Their situation recalled the biblical end of days, the final battle on earth that ends with the dawning of a new paradise. The significant victory they won, regardless of its religious parallels, would have given rise to hopes for an enduring post-war order that ensures a decent standard of living at home in the Caribbean. However, on their return home, these hopes were horribly dashed. The British West Indies Regiment were sent to Taranto in Italy for demobilisation. And
Italian civilian labourers, in fact, went on strike and was successful in receiving a pay award. At the same time, the British West Indies Regiment was actually commanded to dig latrines for Italian labourers, which was regarded by the West Indian soldiers as wholly unacceptable. And as I say, it really brought to a head a series of grievances and a sense of discontent that had probably been brewing over a number of years. In terms of the wider impact of the Taranto mutiny, which eventually spread to all the West Indian battalions stationed at Taranto, and which led to them being forcibly disarmed, and also a battalion of the Worcester Regiment sent to suppress any further discontent. In the wake of the mutiny itself, a group of around 50 or 60 non-commissioned West Indian soldiers established an organisation called the Caribbean League, which was established essentially to promote the welfare and well-being of West Indian veterans once they returned home to the West Indies.
Attitudes to race across the British Empire are affected profoundly by the experience of the First World War. In 1917, when the state opening of Parliament happens, it is attended by wounded soldiers, recovering soldiers from across the empire. And this is symbolic of the position that the empire has reached in British consciousness by 1917, the realization of how important the imperial contribution has been to the armed forces of the empire and to the wider war effort, and the corollary of that, which is the realization that actually political representation might be a consequence as well.
The British West Indies Regiment are what I would call the pioneers, because these were the first men to go off to war to see battle in places that really nobody in the Caribbean knew about. They were patriots. They came to the call of the empire when they were called. It was an avenue for them to meet as Caribbean nationals, to see themselves and the opportunities beyond the war, the establishment of a regional community. The discrimination that they faced was horrible, but it also propelled so much change within the Caribbean. And that change is important, that we have that discussion, that we acknowledge what they went through and how it has made us who we are.